The wagon rocked over the bunch grass at a walking pace, and a child held the wooden side with both hands, watching a land that had no edge to it, no fence, no ridge, nothing but grass running out to meet a sky that pressed down on all of it. She was 9 years old, and she had been pulled out of green Virginia hills only days before, set down in a country so flat and so vast that it seemed to have erased everything she knew. There were no trees to break the wind. No familiar shapes against the horizon. Somewhere off in that endless grass a meadowlark rose, sang a few bright notes, and dropped back down into the green. The child looked at the place where it had vanished, and she pressed her lips together, because she had decided, with a fierce private resolve, that she was not going to cry. She did not yet know that this country would make her. She only knew that it frightened her, the way the open ocean frightens someone who has never left the shelter of a harbor. The road was barely a road at all, to faint trails worn into the grass by other wagons, and the team moved slowly through it, the wheels groaning, the dust rising and settling behind them. Her grandmother sat near her. The family's belongings were packed in around them, the last solid things from a life that already felt very far away. With every mile the woods of home receded further into memory, and the girl held on tighter, watching the grass and the sky trade the whole world between them. Years later, when she was a woman with her name on the covers of books, she would describe that first ride in a single unforgettable line. She said the land had felt like the end of everything, like a kind of erasure of personality. It was a strange thing for a celebrated author to confess. Most people, looking back on a childhood, soften the hard parts. She did not. She remembered the fear exactly, because the fear had been the beginning. The flat country that had threatened to swallow her would one day become the great subject of her life, the thing she returned to again and again, long after she had left it for the cities of the East. But that came later. On that April afternoon in 1883, she was only a homesick girl in the bottom of a wagon, and the prairie did not care whether she stayed or went. It simply stretched out around her, indifferent and immense, waiting. The wind moved across the grass in long slow waves, and the larks kept rising and singing and falling, and the wagon kept rolling west into a country that would take her decades to understand, and a lifetime to leave behind. Her name was Willa Cather, and she had been born far from this place, in the gentle valleys of western Virginia, on a December day in 1873. Back Creek Valley was old country, settled for generations, marked everywhere by the long memory of the Civil War that had only recently ended. Her people had been there since the 1700s. There were sheep on the family farm, and a Greek revival house called Willow Shade, and woods full of the small sounds a child learns to love. It was a settled world, dense with history and family and the deep culture of the rural South, and for the first 9 years of her life, it was the only world she had. Then the fevers came. Tuberculosis was moving through the Virginia hills in those years, and Cather's father and grandparents grew uneasy. There was farmland waiting in Nebraska, where her father's parents had already gone to homestead, and the dry open country was said to be healthier than the damp valleys of the East. The decision was made the way such decisions often are, slowly, and then, all at once. In the spring of 1883 the family packed what it could carry and joined the great westward tide of Americans who were pouring onto the plains, chasing land and health, and the promise of beginning again. They traveled as a household, not as a single family, but as a small migrating world. Her mother and father came, and her grandmother Rachel, and her younger brothers and sisters, and the hired girl and her brother, all of them bound together for the long journey to Webster County. When they finally reached the little prairie town of Red Cloud, and climbed down at the depot, the country opened before them with a vastness none of the Virginia children had ever imagined. 12 miles of open range lay between the town and her grandfather's homestead. They drove it slowly, and somewhere along that road the child in the wagon began to understand that there would be no going back. For 16 months the family lived on the divide, in the high open country between the Republican and the Blue Rivers, and there a curious thing happened to the frightened girl. The fear did not leave her, but something else grew up beside it. She began to listen. The divide was sparsely settled, but it was not empty. Scattered across it were the dugouts and sod houses of immigrants, Bohemians, and Scandinavians, and Germans who had come even further than the Cathers, all the way across an ocean, to break this same hard ground. They spoke languages the girl could not understand, cooked food she had never tasted, and carried in them the memory of villages and churches, half a world away. To a curious child, They were a revelation. She rode her pony from farm to farm, sitting in their kitchens, listening to their stories, gathering the details without yet knowing why. She was, by every account, an unusual child. Sharp-tongued and restless, brilliant and a little wild. She had no patience for the quiet, domestic life expected of girls in that time and place. She cropped her hair short. She dressed in a boyish way, signed her name as William, and announced that she intended to become a doctor. The country that had terrified her was beginning to belong to her, and she to it, in a way she could not have explained. The immigrant women in their kitchens, the long light over the wheat, the great silences of the open land, all of it was sinking into her, settling into the deep places where stories are made. After about a year and a half on the homestead, the family gave up farming. Her father had not the temperament for it, and the children needed proper schooling, so the Cathers moved into Red Cloud itself, a town of perhaps 1,800 people strung along the Burlington Railroad. 8 passenger trains passed through every day. There was an opera house, built the year after they arrived, where traveling companies performed and lecturers held forth, and for a girl hungry for the wider world, it was a window thrown open. Her father rented a house, opened an office dealing in insurance and loans and real estate, and the family settled into the small ordinary rhythms of town life. It was in Red Cloud that her education truly began, though not only in the schoolroom. Next door lived a cultured Jewish couple, the Wieners, who spoke French and German and kept a library finer than anything the town had seen. They opened it to her without hesitation. Mrs. Wiener would read aloud from French novels, translating as she went, and the girl sat and drank it in. Down the street lived the Miners, whose house was full of music there. For the first time, Cather heard a piano played with real feeling, and she would sit listening as though something essential were being poured into her. And there was the hired girl. In the Miner household worked a young bohemian immigrant named Janis, bright and warm and full of life, whose family had come to Nebraska and lived for a time in a dugout cut into the earth. Annie's father had brought a violin from the old country and little else, and the new land had broken him. Unable to bear the loneliness and the failure of it, he had taken his own life out on the open prairie. The girl who listened to Annie's story could not have known that she was gathering the seed of the novel that would one day carry her name around the world. The years in Red Cloud shaped her in a way the homestead had only begun. She made friends with the town doctors and rode with them on their calls, holding the lamp, watching them work, certain still that medicine would be her life. She read everything she could reach. She argued and showed off and made herself impossible to ignore. One neighbor remembered her as a kind of small explosion, a child who could not be overlooked. Whatever she was going to become, it was clear to everyone around her that she was going to become something. In 1890, at 16, she graduated from the Red Cloud High School in a class of 3, the only girl among 2 boys. Each of them gave a speech from the stage of the opera house, and hers was a defense of scientific inquiry, a ringing argument for the right to ask hard questions about the natural world. The local paper predicted great things for the 2 boys. About the girl, it said nothing at all. She read that silence, and she did not forget it. That autumn she left for Lincoln and the University of Nebraska, carrying with her the short hair and the male nickname, and the firm intention of becoming a surgeon. She enrolled, and for a time the plan held. Then, in her first year, something happened that quietly rearranged the whole course of her life. A professor, impressed by an essay she had written on the Scottish writer Thomas Carlyle, sent it to a Lincoln newspaper without telling her. One morning she opened the paper and found her own words there, in print. Looking back at her, the effect, she said later, was almost hypnotic. To see her own thoughts set in type, made permanent and public, did something to her that no scalpel ever could. She began writing columns for the paper at $1 apiece. She took over the editing of a student publication. She wrote, and somewhere in those years the dream of medicine fell quietly away, replaced by something she had not gone looking for. When she graduated in 1895, it was not with a plan to heal bodies. It was with a degree in English, and a hunger she did not yet know how to feed. There was no clear path for a young woman from the Nebraska Prairie who wanted to write for a living. There were almost no examples to follow, no map to the country she meant to enter, so she did what people without a map do. She went toward the work, wherever it could be found. and trusted that the rest would come. In 1896, a small women's magazine in distant Pittsburgh offered her a job, and she packed her things again and went east, leaving the open country for a city of steel mills and coal smoke. More than 1,000 miles from the grass, Pittsburgh was everything the Prairie was not. It was crowded and grimy and loud, the sky stained by the foundries, the rivers thick with traffic. She threw herself into it. She edited the magazine, and when it was sold she moved to a newspaper, writing reviews of plays and concerts with a sharpness that made people notice. She taught Latin and algebra and English in the city high schools, eventually heading an English department, pouring out stories and poems in whatever hours were left. She was building a life with her own hands, brick by brick, far from home. In Pittsburgh she also fell, for the first time, into a love that would mark the whole of her life. Her name was Isabel McClung, a beautiful and cultivated young woman from a prominent family, and the two became inseparable. Isabel brought her into the McClung home to live, gave her a quiet room of her own in which to write, and offered her the thing a working teacher rarely has: time and shelter, and the steady devotion of someone who believed in her completely. For Cather, who guarded her private heart fiercely all her life, Isabel became the center of everything. With that shelter around her, the writing deepened. In 1903 she published a small book of poems, and 2 years later a collection of short stories called The Troll Garden, which held some of the finest work she had yet done, stories about artists and longing, and the gap between the dreaming soul and the world that grinds it down. People in the larger literary world began to take notice of the name on the cover. Among them was one of the most powerful editors in America, a restless Irish immigrant named S. McClure, whose magazine was famous across the country. McClure read her stories and wanted her, and when McClure wanted something he was difficult to refuse. In 1906 he offered her an editorial position at his magazine in New York, and she took it. At 33 she left Pittsburgh for the city that would be her home, in one way or another, for the rest of her life. The job was demanding and high, the magazine a national force, and she rose quickly inside it. She traveled, she edited, she ghost wrote a long serialized biography that ran under another name. She was, by any ordinary measure, a great success, and yet, for all the prestige of the editor's desk, a quiet uneasiness had begun to gather in her. She was spending her gifts on other people's work, on the urgent ephemeral business of a monthly magazine, and the stories that were truly hers were going unwritten. She was nearly 40, with a reputation as an editor, and almost nothing of her own to show for the deepest part of herself. The grass country of her childhood kept rising up in her mind, unbidden, asking to be put into words. The question was whether she had the courage to answer it. The answer, when it came partly through another person. In Boston she had met an older writer named Sarah Orne Jewett, a quiet New England woman who wrote with great delicacy about the people and places she knew best. Jewett saw something in the younger woman that the younger woman had not yet trusted in herself, and she said it plainly. "Stop scattering yourself," she told her. "Stop writing about a world you have only observed. Go back to your own country, your own people, the things you knew before you knew anything else. Write about what is truly yours." The advice landed like a key turning in a lock. Jewett died not long after, in 1909, but her words stayed with Cather for the rest of her life, and they began, slowly, to change everything. Cather looked back across all those years, the wagon and the grass and the larks, the immigrant kitchens, Annie Sudilek, and her broken father, the great silences of the divide, and she understood at last that the subject she had been searching the world for had been waiting for her at the beginning all along. Still she hesitated. To leave the security of the magazine was to gamble everything on an uncertain art, and she was not a reckless woman. Her first attempt at a novel, written in the polished manner of the fashionable world, came out in 1912 to kind reviews, but she herself soon judged it thin and false, a clever imitation of other people's books. It had not come from the deep place. It had not come from the grass. She set it behind her, and she made a decision that frightened her. Even as she made it, she would write the country she came from, in her own voice, and let the world think what it would. The book that came out of that decision arrived in 1913, and it was called O Pioneers. It was unlike the fashionable novels of its day, slow and luminous and rooted in the soil, the story of a Swedish immigrant woman who pours her whole strength into the wild land, and bends it, at last, to her will. There were no glittering drawing rooms in it, no fashionable wit, There was only the great flat country and the people who broke it, rendered with a tenderness and a gravity that had never quite been given to such people before. Readers who had grown up on the plains read it and felt, for the first time, that their own lives had been written down and made to matter. The writer Sinclair Lewis would later say that she had made the whole world able to see Nebraska. She had taken the very country that once threatened to erase her, the flat indifferent grass that had nearly broken her heart at 9 years old, and she had turned it into art that would outlast everyone who ever doubted her. The frightened child in the wagon had found her subject, and her power, at once. She did not stop. 2 years later came The Song of the Lark, the story of a girl from a dusty western town who claws her way to greatness as an opera singer, a story about the cost of art, about what must be given up to make something beautiful. Cather knew that cost in her own bones. She had given up the security of the magazine, the comfort of the editor's desk, the ordinary expectations of a woman of her time, and she had staked it all on the slow and certain labor of the novel. The bet was beginning, at last, to pay. Then, in 1918, she reached the work that would carry her name furthest. It was called My Antonia, and into it she poured everything the immigrant girl Annie she had known as a child, the dugout and the violin, and the father broken by the loneliness of the land, the whole lost world of her Nebraska childhood seen now through the long lens of memory and grief. Near the heart of the book a character looks out across the plains and says of that vast emptiness that there was nothing but land, not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made. It was the truest thing she had ever written. The book did not roar onto the scene. It rose slowly, the way her best things always did, gathering readers year by year, as word passed from one hand to another. But those who loved it completely. Years later, after writing The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald would lament that his own dazzling novel felt like a failure beside My Antonia. She had reached something that the cleverest of her contemporaries could only envy, a plain-spoken, unhurried truth about ordinary people and the land that made them, written so cleanly that it seemed not to have been written at all, only remembered. She had found, by now, the rhythm of her life. In New York she lived quietly and worked hard, sharing a series of apartments with a woman named Edith Lewis, a fellow editor from Nebraska who had come into her life in the early years of the century. Where Isabel had been the great love of her younger heart, Edith became the steady companion of her maturity, the one who managed the practical world so that Cather could disappear into her work, who read her pages and shielded her privacy and stayed at her side for nearly 40 years. In the summer she fled the city entirely. She found a remote island off the coast of New Brunswick, Grand Manan, in the cold tides of the Bay of Fundy, and there she bought a small cottage with no electricity and no running water, reachable only by mail or telegram. The seclusion suited her exactly. She had spent her childhood frightened by too much open space, and now, as a woman, she went looking for it on purpose. The bare cottage, the cold sea, the long undisturbed hours in which the only voices were the ones inside her own head. By the early 1920s her place in American letters was secure. The young publishing house of Alfred Knopf had taken her on, advertising her books with care, dressing them in beautiful editions that pleased her exacting eye. She had grown weary of her old publisher, who had spent almost nothing promoting My Antonia and skimped on the very illustrations she had commissioned for it. With Knopf she felt, for the first time, that her work was being treated as the thing she believed it to be, not merchandise, but art. In 1922 she published One of Ours, a novel about a restless Nebraska farm boy who finds, in the carnage of the First World War, a meaning his narrow life had never offered him. It was a strange and ambitious book, reaching for a battlefield she had never seen, and the critics were divided about it. Some thought it her finest achievement. Others, men who had been to the war, thought she had romanticized a horror she did not understand. Ernest Hemingway sneered that she had borrowed her battle scenes from a moving picture. The barb stung, but the broader world disagreed with the young men. The following spring the announcement came that One of Ours had won the Pulitzer Prize. The girl whose own hometown newspaper had once predicted nothing for her, the woman who had walked away from a secure career to gamble on her own voice, now held the highest literary honor her country could give. She had been right, and the doubters had been wrong, and the proof was now beyond argument. But the prize, like all such things, settled over a life that was already beginning, in ways she could not yet see. to turn toward its harder season. The decade that followed was the high noon of her powers and her fame. In 1927 came Death Comes for the Archbishop, a serene and radiant novel about two French missionary priests in the deserts of New Mexico, written in a style so calm and assured that it seemed to belong to no fashion at all. It sold by the tens of thousands. Critics called it a masterpiece. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, invited to give hundreds of lectures, courted by Hollywood for the rights to her stories. The frightened child in the wagon had become one of the most honored writers in America, and yet the woman who had earned all this honor was, by temperament, drawing inward rather than out. She had always been intensely private, but now the privacy hardened into something fiercer. She disliked the publicity that fame demanded, the interviews, the photographs, the strangers who felt they owned a piece of her because they had read her books. She wanted the work to speak and herself to remain unseen behind it. The world wanted more of her than she was willing to give, and the distance between what it wanted and what she would surrender began, quietly, to wear on her. The literary winds, too, were beginning to shift against her. A new generation of critics, men shaped by the Great Depression and hungry for fiction that grappled with the crises of the day, looked at her luminous novels of the Prairie past and found them wanting. They called her nostalgic, escapist, a writer who fled into an idealized history, rather than face the wreckage of the present. Her conservative politics did not help her with them. The very qualities that had made her great, her reverence for memory, her devotion to a vanishing world, were now turned against her as failings. She felt the change keenly, though she rarely spoke of it. The world she had loved and recorded was disappearing in fact, as well as in fashion. The open prairie of her childhood was fenced and farmed in modern now. The immigrant pioneers she had known were old or dead. The slow rural America she carried in her heart was being paved over by highways and noise. She had become, in a sense, the keeper of a country that no longer existed, and she began to feel the loneliness of that office, the way one feels the cold when the fire burns low. Then came the year that broke something in her. In June of 1938, her brother Douglas died suddenly of a heart attack. Of all her family, he had been her favorite. The brother of her childhood adventures, the one whose company most reminded her of the open country, and the years before everything grew complicated. The loss struck her with a force that left her unable even to attend his funeral. She could not summon the strength to stand at his grave. The grief simply closed over her, and for a long time she could not write at all. She had barely begun to surface from that loss when the second blow fell. For months later, in the autumn of the same year, Isabel McClung died. Isabel, the great love of her young life, the woman who had given her a room to write in and a heart to write toward, the person, Cather once said, for whom she had written every one of her books. Years before, Isabel had married, and the marriage had wounded Cather deeply, but the bond between the two women had never truly broken. Now it was severed by death, completely and forever, and there was no marriage left to be jealous of, only the silence. That summer she confessed to her brother Roscoe that she could not seem to get hold of herself, that the grief would not lift, that all the months had passed in a kind of darkness she could not push back. It was a rare admission from a woman who guarded her inner life so fiercely. She had built her whole art on memory, on the loving preservation of people and places against the erosions of time, and now time was taking from her, one by one, the very people her memory most needed. The keeper of the vanished world was watching her own world vanish. The two deaths, falling so close together, marked a kind of dividing line in her life, an end of something that would not come again. The great wave of her creative power, which had risen through the 19-teens and crested through the 20s, was beginning to fall. The losses had taken something from the source of the work itself. She did not stop writing, she would never entirely stop, but the prolific energy of her best years was gone, and the books came more slowly now, fewer and darker, wrung out of a spirit that had begun to know how heavy the world could be. In 1940 she finished what would be her last novel. It was called Sapphira and the Slave Girl, and in it she went all the way back to the beginning, back past Nebraska, back to the Virginia of her own early childhood, and beyond, to the world of slavery in the Back Creek Valley, where her family had lived for generations. It was a darker book than anything she had written, more troubled, more shadowed, reaching into the moral wreckage of the Old South. She had been born too late to see, but never far enough away to forget. It was, in a sense, a homecoming, and also a reckoning. The book was a great success in the world, printed in the tens of thousands, chosen by the book clubs, bought by the hundreds of thousands of readers who still loved her name. But it cost her something to write, and finishing it seemed to drain a reserve she could not refill. She returned to her island that summer one last time. After that, with the world tipping into another great war and travel grown difficult, she would never go back to the cottage by the cold sea, never again have those long undisturbed hours in the place where so much of her work had been made. The years of the war closed in around her like a slow tide. She was in her late 60s now, then her 70s, and her body, which had carried her so far, began to fail her in small humiliating ways. A surgery for her gallbladder left her weakened and tethered to home, and then came the cruelest blow of all for a writer, an inflamed tendon in her right hand, the writing hand, the instrument of everything she was. The pain made it agony to hold a pen. The very act that had defined her since that morning she first saw her words in print was being taken from her by her own failing flesh. She fought it as long as she could. She had begun a new novel, set far away in the medieval city of Avignon in the south of France, a strange dark tale of the 14th century. Unlike anything she had attempted before, she worked at it in the hours her hand would allow, in stolen fragments, refusing to let it go. But the body would not cooperate. The pages came slowly, painfully, and then more slowly still, and the great book she imagined would not consent to be born. The mind was willing, as it had always been. It was the hand that had begun to betray her. The honors kept arriving, as honors do, long after the powers that earn them have begun to fade. She was elected to learned societies. In 1944 she received a gold medal for the whole achievement of her life's work, a crown laid on a career that the giver could see, even if she could not bear to, was nearing its close. She accepted the tributes with the same guarded reserve she brought to everything public. The applause was for the books. And the books were finished, most of them, and the woman who had written them sat now in her quiet apartment with a hand that could barely hold a pen. She had become more solitary than ever. She drew her small world tight around her Edith Lewis, who had been at her side for the better part of 4 decades, a few old friends, the memory of those she had lost. She guarded her privacy with an almost ferocious will, refusing interviews, refusing to let the curious in. She had already begun the great act of erasure that would shape how the world remembered her, burning letters, destroying drafts, asking everyone who loved her to do the same. If she could not control her failing body, she would at least control what the future was allowed to see. It is one of the strange contradictions of her nature, this woman who built her art on memory, and then set about destroying the record of her own life. She who had labored to preserve the immigrant women of the Divide, the lost towns, the vanished Prairie. She wanted nothing of herself preserved but the work, the letters that might have told the world who she truly loved, what she truly feared, how the inner life had run beneath the famous surface. Those she wanted gone. She would be known by her novels or not at all. Perhaps it was a final assertion of a will that had been thwarted in so many other ways. The body was failing, the great gift of writing slipping out of her grasp. The world she had loved long since dissolved into the past. But this one thing remained within her power. She could decide what survived her. She could draw the curtain herself, on her own terms, rather than let strangers tear it open after she was gone. For a woman who had been told, at 16, that her hometown paper had nothing to predict for her, it was a last fierce claim on her own story. And so she made her arrangements with care. Her will would forbid the publication of her private letters, and the dramatization of her books. The new novel set in Avignon, the one she could not finish, the one her ruined hand would not let her complete, that, she instructed, was to be destroyed at her death. Nothing unfinished, nothing imperfect, nothing she had not herself approved would be allowed to stand under her name. She had spent her life making things whole and beautiful, and she would not let the world see the broken pieces. There is something almost unbearably lonely in the picture of those last years, the great writer in her quiet rooms, the famous hand stilled by pain, the letters feeding the fire, the unfinished book waiting for the flames. She had outlived the Prairie of her childhood, outlived her favorite brother and the love of her youth, outlived even, in a way, her own creative season. What remained was the work already done, the dozen novels standing on the shelf like a row of lit windows in a darkening street, and the long quiet evenings in which she waited for whatever was coming. She knew, by now, what was coming. In the last weeks of 1945 the doctors found cancer in her, and in the middle of January of 1946, she underwent surgery to remove it. For a time she rallied, as the strong do, gathering herself against the thing that was inside her. But the reprieve was only a reprieve. The disease was patient, and it had not finished. Beneath the appearance of recovery, it was moving still, quietly, the way the winter moves beneath the frozen ground, waiting for its season. Through that last year she kept up what appearances she could. She saw the few people she still loved near her. She tended, as well as her hand allowed, to the small business of a literary life. She received the visits of those who loved her with the same composed dignity she had carried all her days. But the woman who had once ridden a pony across the open divide, who had walked away from a secure career to gamble on her own voice, who had stood in the high noon of American fame, that woman was growing very tired now, and she knew it. By the early months of 1947, the cancer had spread to her liver, and there was no longer any pretense of recovery. The end was near, and she met it the way she had met the open prairie at 9 years old, without crying out, holding on. She had spent her life refusing to make a spectacle of her deepest feelings, hiding the great loves and the great griefs behind a calm and guarded surface. She would not change now. She would go quietly, in her own home, on her own terms, with the curtain she had drawn held firmly in place. She was in her apartment on Park Avenue, in the city that had been her home for 40 years, on the 24th of April, 1947. It was spring again, the same season in which a frightened child had once been carried west across the grass. A sudden hemorrhage in the brain took her quickly, before the long agony of the cancer could finish its slow work. She was 73 years old. The hand that had written a whole vanished world into permanence was finally, completely still. Edith Lewis was there, the woman who had shared her life for nearly 4 decades, who had read her pages and guarded her door, and asked nothing of the world but to stay near her, was at her side when the end came. And in the silence that followed, Lewis took up the last and hardest task that her companion had left her. There was the unfinished novel, the one set in Avignon, the one Cather had asked to have destroyed. Lewis honored the wish. She gathered the pages of the book that would never be finished, and she destroyed them, exactly as the woman she loved had instructed. It was an act of devotion as much as obedience, the final service of a love that had never once asked to be named in public. Whatever the world might guess about the two women who had lived together for 39 years, Lewis kept the silence Cather had wanted, and she carried out the destruction without complaint. The book that might have shown the world the strange, dark, last imaginings of a great mind went into the fire, and the world would never know what it had contained. Cather had drawn her curtain, and her companion held it closed. There was a private funeral in New York, quiet and small, as she would have wanted, and then her body was carried to a place she had chosen herself, far from the prairie and far from the city, both a small old burying ground in the village of Jaffrey, in the hills of New Hampshire. She had first come to that country years before, in the company of Isabel McClung, and her husband, staying at a country inn, and the quiet New England hills had taken hold of her the way certain places did. She had decided, long ago, that this was where she wanted to lie. They buried her in the corner of the old graveyard, beneath the New Hampshire sky, and on her stone they cut a line from the book that had carried her name furthest into the world. It was a phrase from my Antonia, words she had given to a character looking out across the great plains of her childhood, about the feeling of being dissolved into something complete and great, into the earth and the sun and the running grass. The words she had written about the country that once frightened her now marked the place where she would rest. It was the country, in the end, that had made her, and that she could never leave. She had spent a lifetime moving away from it, to Lincoln, to Pittsburgh, to New York, to the cold island in the northern sea, and a lifetime returning to it on the page, again and again, in book after book. The grass that had nearly broken her heart at 9 years old had become the great gift of her life, the thing she understood as no one before her had, the subject that turned a frightened child into one of the finest writers her country ever produced. For a time after her death, the literary winds that had turned against her in the 30s kept blowing. She was remembered as a fine but minor figure, a nostalgic regionalist, a writer of pretty prairie books out of step with a harder age. The very privacy she had guarded so fiercely worked against her too, with the letters burned, and the will forbidding their publication. There seemed so little of the woman left to know, only the smooth, unbroken surface of the work, and the silence she had built around herself. But the work would not stay quiet. The novels kept being read, kept being pressed from one reader into the hands of another, the way my Antonia had first made its slow way in the world. Year by year, generation by generation, people kept opening O Pioneers. And death comes for the Archbishop and the great Nebraska books. and finding in them something that did not age, a clean, unhurried truth about ordinary people and the land that shaped them, written so plainly that it seemed less like art than like memory itself. The critics who had dismissed her as a relic began, slowly, to look foolish. What had seemed in the anxious 30s like a retreat into the past came to look, with distance, like something rarer and more lasting, a profound attention to the things that do not change, to loss and longing, and the deep human attachment to place. The fashions that had passed her by passed on themselves, as fashions do, and when they had gone her books were still there, undimmed, waiting on the shelf like windows lit against the dark. The very thing that had drawn the scorn of her critics, her devotion to memory, to the vanished and the lost, became the source of her endurance. She had understood, perhaps better than any American writer of her time, that the deepest subject of fiction is not the noise of the present, but the ache of the past, the way a place and a people sink into us in childhood, and shape us forever after. She had written that ache so truly that readers a century later, who had never seen a prairie, would feel it in their own chests. And the woman herself, for all her efforts to vanish behind the work, would not stay hidden after all. In the years that followed, the letters that had survived the burning, and many had, scattered in the keeping of friends and family who could not bring themselves to obey, began, after the last restrictions lifted, to come to light. More than 500 of them were gathered and published at last, decades after her death, and through them the guarded woman finally spoke in her own private voice. They did not betray her deepest secrets, exactly, she had been too careful for that, even in private. But they made one thing unmistakably clear that she had kept veiled all her life, that her great loves, the attachments that had shaped her heart and fed her art, had been to women. Isabel, for whom she said she had written all her books. Edith, who stayed at her side for 39 years, and held the curtain closed at the end. The woman who had drawn the veil so tightly had, in the surviving fragments, left just enough light to be seen by. There is a kind of justice in it, though not the kind she chose. She had wanted to be known by her work alone, to keep the inner life sealed away, to control what the future was allowed to see, and the work does stand, magnificent and entire, exactly as she wished. But the woman behind it has come into focus too, slowly, gently, not exposed and not betrayed, but understood at last as a fuller and more complicated and more human figure than the calm public surface ever revealed. She had grown up in a time and place that had no room for a woman like her, no room for the short hair and the boy's name and the fierce ambition, no room for a heart that loved as hers did, no room for a girl who wanted to make great art instead of a quiet domestic life. She had made the room herself, by sheer force of will, brick by brick, story by story, and in doing so she had widened the world a little for everyone who came after her, every reader who ever felt out of step with the place they were born into. The little prairie town she had come from understood, in time, what it had been given. Red Cloud, which had once predicted nothing for its strange, brilliant daughter, became a place of pilgrimage. Her childhood home was preserved, and the opera house where she had given her graduation speech, and the farms and houses that had become, transfigured, the settings of her novels. The country that had nearly erased her at 9 years old now kept her memory the way a family keeps the picture of someone it failed to honor in life. And the immigrant woman at the center of her greatest book, Annie, the bohemian hired girl with the broken father, who had become the radiant Antonia of the novel, lived on too, in her own right, on a Nebraska farm not far from where it all began. She raised a large family on that hard land, exactly as the character had, and she lived to know that her life had become a book that the whole world read. The girl who had once listened in the minor kitchen had given her old friend a kind of immortality neither of them could have imagined. This is the strange alchemy that Cather worked again and again across her life, the turning of loss into permanence, of vanishing things into things that last. The prairie disappeared, and she made it eternal. The immigrant pioneers died off, and she made them deathless. Her brother and her great love were taken from her, and grief nearly silenced her, and yet out of even that darkness came a final book reaching back to the very beginning. She could not stop time, but she could, with words, hold a little of it still. It is worth remembering how unlikely all of it was. A girl carried west into a country that frightened her, told by her own town that she would amount to nothing, with no path before her, and almost no examples to follow, in an age that gave women like her so little room to breathe. By every reasonable measure she should have disappeared into the ordinary, into the domestic life expected of her, into the silence the world had prepared. Instead she became one of the great voices her country produced. and the silence became hers to command. She did it not by railing against the world, but by attending to it, by listening, as that frightened child had first learned to listen in the immigrant kitchens of the Divide. Her whole art was an act of attention, a refusal to let ordinary lives go unrecorded, a faith that the deepest meanings lie not in spectacle, but in the quiet textures of how people actually live and love and lose. She had been a listener before she was ever a writer, and she remained one to the end, even when she had grown too famous and too guarded to let the world listen back. The land she wrote about is still there, of course, though changed beyond recognition. The open range is fenced and farmed, the sod houses are gone, the trains that once passed through Red Cloud 8 times a day are mostly memory now, but the country she made out of that country, the Nebraska of pioneers. And my Antonia, the desert of the Archbishop, the prairie of 100 remembered mornings, that country is permanent, and anyone can enter it simply by opening the books. Inside them the larks still rise out of the grass and sing their few bright notes and drop back down. The immigrant women still tend their kitchens against the loneliness of the great land. The light still lies long and golden over the weed-out evening. The frightened child still holds the side of the wagon, and refuses to cry. She put all of it down so faithfully, with such love and such unhurried truth, that it cannot now be lost, no matter how the actual world is paved and altered and forgotten. That was the thing she had been reaching for, all the way back to the morning she first saw her own words in a newspaper, and felt that strange hypnotic pull. Not fame, though fame came. Not the prizes, though the prizes came too. What she wanted was to make permanent the things that were passing, to stand against the great erasure that had frightened her on the prairie, the erasure of personality, of memory, of whole ways of life. She wanted to write things down so well that they would not vanish, and she succeeded. Her own personality she chose, in the end, to let vanish, burning the letters, drawing the curtain, hiding the heart behind the work. But the work itself she made indestructible, and through it, despite all her precautions, the personality survives anyway, in the only form she would have permitted, not in gossip or scandal or biography, but in the voice. To read her is to be in the presence of a particular mind, unmistakable, exact, full of a tenderness she rarely allowed herself to show in life. There is a quiet lesson buried in the shape of her life, though she would have hated to see it stated so plainly. She had been given, at 9 years old, what felt like a catastrophe, torn from everything she loved, and set down in a barren place that seemed to threaten her very self. And out of that catastrophe she made the central treasure of her art. The thing that nearly broke her became the thing that made her. The wound and the gift, in her, were the same. Few writers have understood so deeply that we are made by the places we come from, and made most of all by the places we are forced to leave. All her great books are, in one way or another, about exile and return, about people carried away from the country of their childhood, and forever trying, on the page, or in the heart, to find their way back. She wrote it so well because she had lived it. The grass had marked her, and she never stopped writing her way home. In the small graveyard in New Hampshire, beneath the line from her own most famous book, she lies still. And some years after, when her own long life was over, Edith Lewis was laid beside her. The companion of for decades come at last to rest at her side. To women who had built a life together in an age that had no words it was willing to speak for them, lying now under the same northern sky, the silence between them finally a peaceful one. The stone gives little away, as she wanted. A name, a span of years, a single borrowed sentence about dissolving into something complete and great. A stranger walking through that quiet ground might pass it without a second glance, never guessing that here lay the woman who had given America some of its truest pictures of itself. She would not have minded. She had never wanted the monument. She had wanted the books. And the books were enough. Think of the distance she traveled, not the miles. Though the miles were great, from Virginia to Nebraska to Pittsburgh to New York, to a cold island in a northern sea. Think of the distance from that frightened child holding the side of a wagon to the celebrated author whose words would be carved in stone. The distance from a town that predicted nothing for her to a place among the finest writers her nation ever made. She crossed all of it on the strength of her own attention, and her own refusal to be erased. And think of what she carried with her the whole way: the grass, the larks, the great silences, the immigrant women in their kitchens, the broken father and his violin, the long golden light over the wheat. She never put any of it down. She carried her childhood country in her like a lit lamp through all the dark cities and the lonely years, and when she needed it she had only to look inward, and there it was, waiting, exactly as it had been on that first frightening afternoon. That is what it means, perhaps, to be a writer of her kind, to be marked so deeply by a place and a time that you spend your whole life giving it back to the world, transfigured, made permanent, saved from the erasure that takes everything else. She had feared, at 9, that the prairie would erase her. Instead, she made herself the one who could not be erased, and made the prairie, through her, deathless along with her. The fear and the triumph, in the end, were two halves of the same long story. She has been gone now for the better part of a century, and the world she knew has passed almost entirely out of living memory. The pioneers are gone. The open range is gone. The slow rural America she loved has dissolved into something she would scarcely recognize. And still the books are read. Still the larks rise in their pages. Still readers who have never stood on a prairie feel the great open country pressing down on them, and the ache of leaving home, and the long impossible wish to return. If you were to drive out today across the country she wrote about, in the late light of a summer evening, you might still catch some shadow of what she saw: the wheat running gold to the horizon, the enormous sky, the wind moving in long slow waves across the grass. It is fenced now, and farmed, and crossed by roads she never imagined. But the light is the same light, and the silence, where you can still find it, is the same silence she carried in her heart, all the way to a graveyard in New Hampshire. She would not want a lesson drawn, or a moral pin to the end of her life like a label on a specimen. She distrusted such things. She believed that meaning lived in the thing itself, in the grass and the light in the faces of ordinary people, not in pronouncements about them. So perhaps the truest tribute is simply to remember the child in the wagon, holding on with both hands, watching the larks rise and fall, deciding with all her small fierce will that she was not going to cry. She did not cry. She listened instead, and she remembered. And in time she wrote it all down, the country and the people and the loss and the longing, so faithfully and so well that none of it could be taken from the world after all. The land that had threatened to erase her became, through her, one of the most enduring places in American literature, and the frightened girl became the keeper of it, the one who would not let it disappear. Somewhere in the books she left behind, that April afternoon is still happening. The wagon is still rocking over the bunch grass. The grandmother is still beside her. The grass is still running out to meet the sky in every direction. And the larks are still rising, singing their few splendid notes, dropping back down into the green. And the child is still watching, taking it all in, beginning without knowing it. The long work of a lifetime, the work of holding on to everything that the world tries to let go. Willa Cather spent 73 years learning that the things we lose are not always lost, that what disappears can sometimes be saved, that a country which breaks a child's heart can become the great love of her life. She learned it on the prairie, and she taught it to everyone who has ever opened her books and felt, in the quiet of her sentences, the presence of a vanished world made suddenly, achingly present again. In the end, she gave away far more than she ever let anyone take. She kept her secrets and burned her letters and drew her curtain tight. And still she gave the world its prairie and its pioneers, its immigrant women and its long golden evenings, its truest sense of what it means to come from somewhere, and to carry that somewhere with you all your days. She held herself back, and gave everything that mattered. The grass is still there, in the books, exactly as she left it. The light is still long and golden over the wheat, and somewhere in that country she made out of the country that made her, a meadowlark rises out of the grass, sings a few bright notes, and drops back down into the green, and a child watches the place where it vanished, and does not cry, and begins, without yet knowing it, to remember everything. She had come to that country as a stranger, a frightened girl from the green hills of Virginia, certain she had reached the end of everything. She left it, finally, as its truest voice, the one who had seen most clearly what it was, and what it meant, and what it would cost to lose it. Between those 2 points lay a whole life of attention and labor and quiet refusal, and out of that life came a shelf of books that will outlast every name that ever doubted her. The doubters are forgotten now. The hometown paper that predicted nothing for her is a footnote in her story. The critics who called her a relic are themselves the relics, and her supposedly old-fashioned books grow only more alive with time. She has outlasted all of them, as she outlasted the prairie and the pioneers, by the one means available to her, by writing so truly that the truth could not die. It began with a child who would not cry, and it ended with a woman who would not be erased, and in between there was the grass. always the grass, running out to meet the sky. She put it into words that have not faded, and will not fade, and as long as anyone opens her books, the larks will keep rising, and the light will keep falling gold across the wheat, and the great open country will keep pressing down on the hearts of strangers who have never been there, and will somehow always know the way home. That was her gift, and her victory, and her quiet revenge against the Iraja she had feared all her life. Not a monument, not a confession, not a name carved larger than the rest. Only the grass, and the light, and the larks, and the unbroken voice of a woman who had learned, on a frightening afternoon long ago, to hold on to everything, and who never, to the very end, let go. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter in our journey through the lives that shaped history. There are so many more of these stories waiting to be told, quiet, remarkable lives that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for listening, and for caring about the people whose voices still reach us across the years.